If you're currently using app services that were created with Terraform, you may or may not be aware of the changes coming to the AzureRM Provider that affect those resources. If we go to the docs page for AzureRM App Service, there is a note explaining that AzureRM App Service has been deprecated in version 3 of the provider and will be completely removed in version 4. Basically, they've split up the app services by OS. Originally, you could use AzureRM App Service to create either Windows or Linux apps. Now, you just need to specify that by which resource you use. The replacements for AzureRM App Service are AzureRM Linux Web App and AzureRM Windows Web App. The other thing that has changed is the AzureRM App Service Plan. Navigating to the docs page for App Service Plans, we can see a similar note. AzureRM App Service Plan will be removed in version 4 and has been replaced by AzureRM Service Plan. So in order to be able to take advantage of any new features in version 4, you should consider moving over to the new resources that have been added. I've spent a little bit of time looking at the differences between the old and the new resources based on some of the app services that I've stood up in the past, so let's check it out. In VS Code, I've cloned a repo from my GitHub with some examples that I put together. The link for that repo will be in the description. Now, just as a warning, app services can accumulate costs if you leave them running, so be careful. I'm using a cheap tier for all my app service examples, and I make sure that I destroy everything after I'm finished. If you're following along, I suggest you do the same. First, let's take a look at Linux apps. On the left-hand side, I have the deprecated resources, and on the right, I have their replacements. At first glance, they seem to be pretty similar, but there are some important changes. The first change I noticed is the reserved attribute. AzureRM App Service Plan required that that be set to true if the kind was set to Linux. Under AzureRM Service Plan, however, that field is not needed and is set automatically based on the OS type. So that's why I commented it out. The next difference is the SKU. AzureRM App Service Plan had a SKU block where you would set the tier and size of the app service plan. That has been replaced by SKU name in the AzureRM Service Plan, and capacity has been replaced with worker count. Further down, we can also see some differences in the app service. Aside from the difference between App Service Plan ID and Service Plan ID attribute names, we can see that the site config block has changed a little. And one thing to mention as well is that both Windows Web App and Linux Web App resources require a site config block. You used to be able to leave it out, but now it's required, even if it's empty. On the left, under the old app service resource, I specified the .NET Framework version, Linux FX version, which is just a Hello World container for this demo, and always on. However, under the new Linux Web App resource, they've added an application stack block under site config. This is where we define the container image now, and you can see that it has split up the Docker image and tag into two separate attributes. Under application stack is also where you would specify other parts of your stack, such as .NET version here. Check out the documentation for the full list of accepted attributes. Now let's take a look at Windows apps. On the left, we have the deprecated app service resources, and on the right is the new AzureRM Windows Web App resource. The difference on the service plan for a Windows app is pretty much the same as for Linux, except OS type is set to Windows. You can also see that the Windows web apps also have the new application stack block under site config. Now let's take a look at Linux function apps. Function apps will still require a storage account when creating them, but I haven't noticed anything different that needs to be done there, so we can go ahead and leave that unchanged. And the service plan also looks the same as the web apps we just went over. The biggest differences I've noticed here are that the site config block is required again, and the storage account access key is optional. Previously, that was required. I haven't done any testing with this and don't have much experience with function apps yet, so I'm not sure what the implications are if you leave it out. The last resource we're going to take a look at is Windows function apps. Here I haven't really noticed too much of a difference from the Linux function apps. I just wanted to show you the example of using AzureRM Windows function app here. Okay, let's go back to the Linux apps folder and reopen the files. Now, even though the definition of these resources has changed, let's take a look at what they look like under the hood. I'm going to switch to the Linux apps directory. First, I'll run a Terraform init to initialize Terraform. And then I'll run a Terraform apply. After the apply runs, you can see that Terraform is warning us that the configuration contains deprecated resources, which I expected. Now I want to take a look at what these new apps look like, so I'm going to use Terraform state show to take a look at them side by side. First, I'll get the deprecated app service by specifying its name. Now I can select the output, and I'll paste that into a new file on the left. I'm also going to set the language mode to Terraform to make it easier to read. Now let's do the same for the new Linux web app. And I'll copy and paste that output into a new file on the right. Okay, so if I scroll down, you can see that they look almost exactly the same, with just some minor differences. If we compare site config, you'll notice that the list for the new Linux web app resource is a little bit longer. We can also see the new application stack section all the way at the bottom. Okay, now let's say you've already got some AzureRM app service resources deployed, and you want to be ready for version 4 of the provider. You could just destroy your existing resources and create new ones. Or, if you'd rather not destroy your resources, they have luckily made it easy to import an AzureRM app service into one of the new resources. Let's take a look by closing these files and going into the demo folder. I'm also going to switch to the demo folder in my terminal. This configuration stands up a deprecated app service and app service plan. First, I need to initialize Terraform in this folder. Next, I'll run an apply. Now that the apply is finished, we can walk through the steps that we need in order to move the app service over to the new Linux web app resource. There are probably several ways to go about this, but this is the typical process that I usually follow. First, to do an import, we're going to need the ID of the remote app service that we just created. I could get that by navigating to the portal, but I'm going to use Terraform state show here to get it. Scroll up until you find the ID and copy that to the clipboard. I'm just going to drop that into my main.tf file for later. Next, we need to create an empty resource block for AzureRM Linux web app. I'm just going to call it new web app. Now we need to remove the deprecated resource from state using Terraform State RM. We're going to use Terraform State RM here because we want to remove this resource from our configuration state. However, we don't want to destroy the remote object. So let's type in Terraform State RM in the terminal. Then we need the address of the resource we're removing. In this case, it's AzureRM app service.as Linux demo. Now hit enter. After that resource has been successfully removed, we can remove the resource block from main.tf. Next, in the terminal, enter Terraform import. The import command then needs the address of the new resource block that we'll be importing into. In this case, it's the AzureRM Linux web app.new web app that we just created. And finally, we need to cut and paste the ID from the old app service that we grabbed earlier. Now let's save main.tf and hit enter down in the terminal. Once the import is successful, let's do a quick Terraform state show on the new resource. You can use the output from the show command to start filling in the blank resource with the attributes that you want to manage with Terraform, or you could just put them in manually. Now that I've updated my new Linux web app block, I'm going to save main.tf and run a plan. You can see that I have a few changes that show up here. Those are attributes that I wasn't managing, so my assumption is that the default values for them has changed in the new resources. You'll also notice that we're still getting the deprecated resource warning because I haven't updated the service plan yet. But you can follow the same process to convert that as well. I'm not going to apply this configuration, so I'm just going to go ahead and destroy my test resources so they don't continue to accumulate costs. The basic takeaways from this is that the AzureRM app services have been broken up by operating system. And since some of the attributes have changed, I definitely recommend looking through the docs for the new app resources in the description and familiarize yourself with any changes that might affect you. I hope that sheds some light on the new changes that are coming. Thanks for watching.